It's official, the EU has sunk into a recession. Its GDP shrank 0.1% in the first quarter of 2023 and in the final 3 months of 2022. Why has the EU sunk into a recession? Well, to say that it's only because of the Ukraine war, that would be premature, but it has certainly contributed to it. In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at all the reasons the EU has fallen into a recession and whether the European governments are doing enough when it comes to the cost of living crisis. First, let me introduce our guests. Paolo Raffone, Secretary General of the CIPI Foundation, joins us from Brussels. Also joining us is Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute, who joins us from Germany. Potsdam, Germany, that is. Schiller Institute at Germany. Okay, great. Welcome to you both. Paolo Raffone, the EU has fallen into a recession. Does that surprise you? I mean, you have reassurances from the European Central Bank before that said, you know, the recession is going to be averted, but that didn't happen.
Well, I'm not surprised at all. The European Central Bank, like all central banks, they think they can curb the inflation just with the monetary policy, so moving up or down the rates. But this is evidently something that doesn't have an incidence on what is happening. So the central banks are maneuvering for a sort of an austerity management of the situation, but this is inefficient because the entire economic cycle in Europe is slowing down, and this is due mostly to the incredible sanctions that the European Union has imposed to Russia and to itself, because it's a sort of self-punishment, which makes the entire economic organization to be in a dire situation. So what will happen in the coming months is yet to be seen, also in terms of energy supplies, which probably will last till the beginning of the winter, but then we will see what happens.
All right, well, Harley Schlanger, what do you think are the reasons behind the EU falling into a recession? Does it surprise you also, or did you think that that was inevitable for it to happen?
Well, I think the problem is, as your other guests pointed out, the idea that you can solve an economic crisis with interest rates motion is absurd. We had quantitative tightening after years of quantitative easing. Quantitative easing was giving almost free credit to companies to cover their bad debts. Then you add the sanctions policy and you add the European Union energy policy, which is an effort to move in a transition to energy sources that will not provide enough energy at adequate prices. At the same time, blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, cutting off Russia, not having access to replace the energy that they've lost. And you have in Germany the shutdown of nuclear plants. So you have energy prices going up, inflation going up, trade deficit going up, and industrial production dropping. One final point, in Germany, 16% of German firms have left the country in the last year, and another 30% are looking at options that they could use, for example, China moving to the United States, and this is affecting especially the automotive sector. So I think there are a lot of self-inflicted wounds related to the Ukraine situation, but also just in terms of the absolute delusions about using the shift away from fossil fuels as a way of protecting against global warming, which I think is fake science.
When we take a look at the reason behind this, most notably, of course, Paolo Raffone, is the fact that you have this Ukraine war, that maybe many think is because of that, given the way that energy prices shot up. But is it fair to say that it's only the Ukraine war? I mean, if we want to go back to when COVID-19 started and the way that the European economies were faring before that, and then going through COVID, for example, many people forget that €1 trillion was actually thrown into the EU economy in order to keep economies afloat. You know, that money is going to somehow have to be recouped somehow. But to just blame the Ukraine war, that would be a mistake, wouldn't it?
Yeah, sure. The situation that has emerged with the Ukraine war is the last straw of a process, and it risks to become the last straw in overall, in the sense that the entire European system may collapse, because the crisis has started at least in 2006 with the financial crisis, and it has never recovered. The attempts that have been made of quantitative easing and other stuff that tried to push drugs into the economy revealed a nonsense, and they created even more problems. The COVID situation has aggravated the already dear situation, and now they don't know really what to do, and they are trying to hide the reality with very inconsistent speeches about interest rates. But it's an unmanageable situation. It would be much better to recognize the reality and to stop the confrontation that we keep towards several countries, not only Russia.
All right, you mentioned how 15%, if I heard your figure correctly, Harley Schlanger, of German businesses that are going abroad. That's quite a number. What is where are they going to, and how do you see that snowballing, that is going to continue, or is that something that's incremental?
No, the survey that was done by the German Confederation of Industry showed that most of these businesses have been looking in the last couple of years at alternatives, largely because of energy and also because of European Union policy. One of the things that's concerning a lot of companies, especially in the machine tool sector, heavy industry, capital goods, auto sector, is the break of trade with China. It's not just the Ukraine situation, but the threats to detach Europe from China, which have come from people like Baerbock and Habeck in Germany. Macron is somewhat different. Macron said we can't do that, but the British are pushing it. They're pushing Italy to break their memo of understanding with the Belt and Road Initiative. So there's an enormous pressure to punish Russia and China, which is going to destroy Europe. And I think the United States is trying to replace Russia with liquefied natural gas, and they're also offering German companies and other companies good terms to relocate to the United States. So I think this is a trend that will continue, but I should point out the United States is in the midst of an accelerating banking crisis, and that's not a solution for these firms.
All right. Well, I was going to talk about this a little bit down the road here, but let's talk about it, Paolo Raffone. When you talk about the way that the U.S. obviously feels about China, which is very well known, they are pushing for European countries to decouple from China. Now, I'm not too sure if I can say that's split in the European countries, but it seems for the most part that Europe does not want to do that. So I'm curious as to whether when Europe doesn't want to decouple from China, doesn't it see what this Ukraine war is doing to its economies, and yet follows the U.S. blindly when it comes to it?
Well, your question is difficult to answer, because it seems for us living here to be led by a group of drunkards, and they simply do not see or do not want to see the reality. So they are obliged to follow the United States because of the situation we know. We were defeated, occupied, and there is the NATO and everything else that makes it that the nation states of Europe and the European Union have their hands tight, so they cannot move. On those who try to say something slightly different, they are put under pressure, as you were mentioning, with all possible means. But the reason is because the United States cannot tolerate that China is calmly, not aggressively, guiding a subversion of the flow of the economy at global level. And this is something they cannot tolerate. Therefore, they want to replicate what they did with the Cold War in Europe many years ago, and they want to apply this to China, which is a total nonsense, which risks also to deflagrate into an atomic confrontation, which would be a catastrophe. So the Europeans are not capable of standing up and tell the United States, look, we do not follow you on a number of issues.
Sure. Well, we're looking at a survey here. I'm looking at one, Harley Schlanger, that says the rising cost of living is the most pressing worry for 93% of Europeans. Now, we know that that's followed by the threat of poverty and social exclusion, which comes in at, let me make sure I read this correctly, 82%. These are pretty high figures. And when you take a look at the protests that are happening in Europe, all across Europe, in a sense, isn't that a worry for the governments? I mean, the numbers, well, I guess France and the UK kind of lead that in terms of the volume of people, or the numbers of people that are coming out. But some European, even Germany, there have been protests, I'm sure. Aren't they worried that these protest numbers may grow? And of course, you have some consequences coming out of that, social crisis perhaps, and even the government may be being threatened.
I think the leaders in Europe are deaf, dumb, and blind to the reality facing the citizens in Europe. If you look at the UK, for example, you have all kinds of strikes going on. You look in France, you have the millions of people in the streets protesting the raising of the retirement age to try and save a few euros on pensions. The problem is there's so little confidence in government, so little faith in government in the populations, that they realize that the local parliaments have almost no influence. There's no sovereignty. They're being treated the same way the International Monetary Fund treats countries in the Global South. Now, in the Global South, these countries are waking up. That's why they're going for a de-dollarization. In Europe, the populations are just wallowing in pessimism, cynicism, and suffering. But I think an explosion will come. There are reports of a hot autumn coming. Wages are falling way behind in Germany. Inflation rates continue 6, 8, 10, 12% across the Eurozone. So I don't think they can suppress this for long. At the same time, the opposition to continual funding of Ukraine, which is getting a large amount of money from European Union countries, huge amounts from the United States, while the people in those countries are having their social welfare needs cut. Sooner or later, this will lead to an explosion. The only question is, will there be a solution coming from the population, or just anger and rage to allow the governments to do a crackdown and the security state intervention?
All right, well, at the heart of the cost of living crisis, if you agree, Paolo Raffone, is the fact that you have obviously the price of goods that have gone up. Food is one of them that is very worrying for Europeans, and of course other sectors also. What is the deal with the energy price, gas and oil in particular? I mean, is Europe, are they actively looking to replace the way that they used to spend money on oil, the governments that is? Because at this point we're looking at, obviously Russia is not going to be in the picture. You can't rely on OPEC when you have Saudi Arabia really looking eastward. It's not really helping Europe in that sense. Because that's where the source of inflation really comes about, in a sense. So what are they going to do to make sure that their energy needs are fulfilled?
Well, they have secured some agreements with Northern African countries, particularly Algeria, in the Gulf with Qatar, but they cover more or less 40% of the need. Now, for the time being, the stocking is full, so we will cover certainly till half of the winter that is coming. So let's say till February, March. But what will happen afterwards is absolutely unknown. We do not know the prices, we do not know the quantities of energy, so anything is possible. And as you were mentioning, the geopolitics may also create some surprises with countries that have signed MOUs, but then they may change mind. So I'm very pessimistic on the way they are managing also this sector.
All right. The way that the approach has been from the U.S. and EU towards Russia has been the sanctions approach. And I'm curious what they're thinking, Harley Schlanger, when they take a look at Russia and the effect that it's had. I mean, if you want to take a look at their oil sales, well, I think for the month of March, it hit pre-sanctions levels before the war started. The amount of oil output and sales that Russia had, and also its GDP growth is still positive. You have energy projects that are shaking off the sanctions, so to speak. So the sanctions are not really having any impact on Russia. Does that play at all into the way that they're thinking towards Russia when it comes to how these sanctions are not impacting Russia the way that they thought?
Well, if you look at Russia, Russia has 2.3% inflation. Russia has very little debt because of the policies they've had and the income they've made from oil. And by the way, Europe is still getting oil and gas from Russia. They're getting it through alternate channels, but that's going to stop. The example of the just absolute incompetence and blindness in the West was Secretary of State Blinken's speech in Helsinki last Friday, where he gloated about how Russia is being destroyed by sanctions, Russia is being isolated. And as he was saying that, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov was touring Africa with great success. The meeting of the BRICS took place. They're planning a major international conference in August and may set up a BRICS currency. As to Russia being isolated, it's the West that's being isolated. So I think besides just incompetence and delusion, there's the belief that something good will come if you keep hammering at Russia's military. If you keep the pressure up, there'll be a regime change move in the population in Russia. It's not going to happen. The West is going to lose this. The only question is whether they will escalate in Ukraine, including the possibility of sending in NATO troops to try to turn the tide there. But this is why it's a great cause for pessimism that you have leaders like Blinken who don't seem to be able to speak without making up stories.
Okay. Well, Europe needs to get its act together when it comes to this coming winter, because according to many sources, Paolo Raffone, the energy reserves that it has is not going to outlast this year. And if they don't think about bringing their energy resources back to the level that they are used to, they're not going to have the reserves for the following year. And that obviously is going to spell disaster. Are they thinking that far ahead, or are they just thinking, how can Ukraine beat Russia on the battlefield?
They just think about how to beat Russia. There is no sense of what they will do after February next year. It's unclear. I'm reasonably informed, and I don't know what to say. I don't know what they do. The fact is that probably by then they will also realize that they have lost the war in Ukraine. So this will be an enormous blow on the political side, which risks to see the EU simply implode. And it's not my opinion, but it's my countryman, Mr. Draghi, opinion, who just gave an interview yesterday saying that if Ukraine doesn't win, this is the end of the EU. So.
Well, taking a look at some of the statements that has come from von der Leyen when she talked about how she's going to spend $360 billion euros that she's going to give out in terms of loans. I'm wondering where this money is going to come from. I mean, I know European businesses, Harley Schlanger, do need obviously help when it comes to many who are not at this point not doing well. But the way that the EU budget works, the EU is not as stable as it used to be, obviously. It's bleeding, the example being that it's gone into a recession. So where does von der Leyen come up with when she says, where's the money going to come through from the statements coming from von der Leyen?
Well, they're just going to print it. It's going to be funny money. It's going to be a new round of hyperinflation if that's what they do. I mean, the problem is that you have to produce more, which means you need markets, which means you need infrastructure. But if you're tearing down infrastructure because you think it's producing too much carbon dioxide, And if you're outsourcing all your industries, where do you get the wealth? And in the old days, in the imperial system, you get the wealth by looting poor countries. That period is over. I think what we're seeing is the emergence of a new non-aligned movement, which is powerful enough to represent an alternative. The credit is being produced in the global south based on expectations of real physical economic growth. In the Eurozone and the United States, there's no guarantee that there's going to be an increase in productivity. In fact, productivity has been declining year by year. So how do you cover the debt? Well, what the U.S. just did is they kicked the can down the road. They raised the debt ceiling and they said, well, we'll cut a little bit here, a little bit there. The best thing they could do would be to stop this damn war right now and kick out the leaders who think that it's a good idea to have a war against Russia and a war against China. The idea of global NATO should be completely thrown out the window. I don't know if it's going to happen, but it will only happen if the people rise up and say, you've got to stop this.
Well, my final question goes to you, Paolo Raffone. When it comes to the most recent NATO meeting that took place, one of the things that the NATO Secretary General talked about, and this was really an eye-opener, was the fact that Ukraine should be given money from each European country in order to keep it building up its military equipment. And this would be obviously to make sure that it's well-equipped to counter Russia. Why is it that that type of approach is being used when you have EU countries as a whole suffering? Their citizens obviously are experiencing this cost of living crisis, yet they want to put aside a war budget for each European country to allot for Ukraine.
Well, let's start to say that the NATO is an American creature that is present in Europe now for several decades. It had some reason to be there immediately after the Second World War and for some time later, but now there is no reason why NATO should be here. And why do we need NATO? Is it in European interest? In my opinion, no. And like me, many other people think that NATO is not in our interest. So whatever they say or they do, it is clearly something that it is in the US interest. And we see it with everything, with the enlargement of NATO, the acceptance of Sweden and Finland in NATO, with the continuation of this war. I mean, we are totally in a trap. Europe is in a trap with NATO on one side, the IMF on the other side, and leaders in Europe who are so weak, who are incapable to stand this situation.
All right, thank you very much for that. Paolo Raffone, Secretary General of the CIPI Foundation. Harley Schlanger, thank you. Schiller Institute Germany. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Mika Vitale and the team, it's goodbye.